Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Sha-En, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for having me. I'm super excited.
Sha-En, I absolutely love what you do. And as I was looking through your work, I came across a word that really intrigued me. And I was wondering if we can maybe start with that. Why do you call yourself a reformed optimist?
I mean, that's such a great question. I guess, as I was growing up, I fell into, I guess, a difficult situation with friends. I was bullied for many years and I started to not think much of myself, with all the treatment that I was facing. And through secondary school, I also had a very difficult time at home. And I often felt like, my world was very bleak. So I guess you could say I was a pessimist. And so when I fell into positive psychology or learned about the science of optimism, I honestly thought it was quite intriguing. Could you actually learn to be optimistic? I thought like this was it. I was born this way. I'm going to be like that for the rest of my life. But as I applied the principles, slowly I began to shift. And if you ask anyone now, they'll be like, oh, Shan's definitely an optimist. And so I feel like I've gone through a reformation process. So I call myself the reformed optimist.
So, optimism is a choice in the end.
Yes. And I think that's the most important lesson, that we can choose it and we can be intentional about feeling more optimistic by challenging the beliefs that we have, and beliefs often feel like so rigid, but all it takes is for us to stop and think, is that really true? Or is it just how I'm feeling in the moment, right? Is that belief something that I should dive straight in, or can I just hold it there at a distance and, interrogate it a little bit? And then you'll start to realize maybe it's just someone else's words and not your own. And so if you don't own it, it doesn't have to be internalized. And the more you question, the more you realize, hey, I can ask a different question, I can have a different answer.
Talking about beliefs, another question that I wanted to ask you, whether you believe there's a difference between happiness and joy. And if you do believe there is one, could you actually elaborate on what the main differences are?
Yeah, so to me, happiness is something that you may feel in the moment, or when someone asks you, how are you going? You seldom say, I'm very joyful. You might say, my life is great and my life is happy. And that's what I call a broad level kind of assessment of your life, right? So we use it very loosely, and it's also one of the most common basic emotions that people would refer to if they're talking about positive state. Happiness comes and goes. It's often quite fleeting, right? But when we think about joy, I often think of joy as something deeper, more intense, and beyond the surface. And it's almost like you can feel it viscerally in your body as something much deeper, and almost that it connects with your soul, right? So you could be very happy, like eating an ice cream, and it gives you that momentary boost, like, oh yeah, life is good, right? But perhaps the joy comes when you are eating the ice cream together with your child in a moment of a beautiful green park where your whole week has been a frazzled week. That to me connects much more deeply than just the ice cream on its own.
How do you help individuals find greater levels of happiness? Can you share with us some of the key practices?
Yeah, and I mean, I like to look at happiness as both internal and external, right? And of course, in the internal parts, there's levels of happiness. Like we talked about that first level of happiness. I think a lot of people know how to access that, and you can access that externally by consuming stuff, buying stuff, looking at stuff, right? So you could watch a good movie and feel very happy. And you could also feel joyful from watching the movie if something in that movie connected deep within you. And then if you go beyond just that surface level, you could have other emotions that maybe we don't talk about as often, like peace, like contentment, right? Like connection, and I think, that's where we have a little bit more nuance on this term called happiness, right? and really allow ourselves to find those differentiations. When do we actually feel peace, right? It could be just in a moment of stillness. It doesn't have to be in a total white green space, but it could just be like, me talking to you now, Andrea. This could be a peaceful moment because we're really present, right? And so I almost feel like we can access this feeling of happiness in various ways, but it starts from inside of us. And are we even aware about these different nuances that live inside of us? Do we have memories or images that perhaps tie to these different emotions that all represent this big cluster of what people refer to as happiness?
In the craziness of life, as possibly some of our listeners that may be going through certain adversities, certain life challenges,
Mm,
how do we bring back that joy? How do we choose the joy despite
mm.
adversities and challenges that we may be facing?
I think the first thing is not to be toxically positive. And if people in the audience haven't heard this term, it means that you choose positivity no matter what, and you smile through your pain. I think those phrases are pretty common, but what that might mean is that you're dismissing that moment where the pain is real and felt. And so, as hard as it may seem, sometimes it may mean that we need to be present with the suffering that we're going through. And sometimes people feel very worried about this or scared about this because nobody wants to jump into pain. Everybody wants to run towards pleasure. But if we don't sit and understand what this pain is all about or understand where it affects us, where it's coming from, then how do we know how to manage it? So, to me, it's the first part is acknowledge that it's there, right? And then maybe if the emotion is very heightened, we may need to take a few calming breaths to bring that awareness into our body and recognize that, you know, before we go on to maybe choosing joy, right? And maybe there are some moments where we can't. Like if we are grieving, then let's be present with the grief and recognize that that's real, that's mine, and it's okay. I'm not the only one going through this, right? And it could also be that such difficult emotions could lie together, coexist with joy, right? So, for example, in the moment of maybe going through a layoff, a friend calls you and asks, "Hey, how are you doing? Do you want to chat about it?" That could be a moment of joy because someone cared about you. And sometimes we think they need to be black or white and they can't coexist, right? So, I guess to summarize, it's like first notice and acknowledge the emotion so that you can sit with it, get to know it. And then maybe after that, you can make a more conscious decision to say, hey, I want to do something different. I want to choose something different. And whether that leads to joy, maybe it takes a few more steps for some people. And maybe for some people, it becomes easier to access once you have acknowledged that.
I want to go back to what you just mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, whereby you lived through many various challenges. And I was curious to understand the process that you had to go through personally to actually implement some of the practices that you were discovering as part of your positive psychology degree and so on, because
Mm,
I'm curious to understand, how do we make happiness or joy sustainable over the long
mm,
term and
yeah.
not fall too deep into depression or into negativity when things do not necessarily go our ways. And actually,
Mm,
life is all about the highs and the lows, but it's also about understanding and appreciating, as you were saying, being present in both the
mm,
highs and the lows. But at the same time, as I said, I'm just so intrigued by so many people that are suffering from depression,
mm-hmm.
from anxiety, when you're looking also at the rising rates of suicide.
Yes.
What do individuals need to do to actually make joy and happiness a large portion of their lives?
You know what? I think that many people are very disconnected from themselves. And when I say that, it means that sometimes we listen a lot to social narratives, what expectations other people have for us. And I think that's was part of my suffering, right? I would hear all these messages like you're not good enough, like, why do you have pimples on your face? I was a teenager and a friend would come up to me and say, you look awful with those pimples. Do you not wash your face? Things like that. And at that stage in my life, I believed it, instead of perhaps looking inside and listening to myself, or maybe the voice inside was just not loud enough for me to listen, or whatever it was, right? But people in our lives form the social narrative, and instead of walking or going closer internally, we respond to the external forces, right? Part of what I also heard growing up was, if you just study hard, you get a good job, meet a nice guy, get married, have those two children, have a nice house, that narrative.
Yes.
And so many of my friends said, yeah, we heard that, like, it was almost as if it's a standard story. And then we
Mm.
walk that story, and then we realize, either some of us halfway through or some of us a few years down from the narrative, and we realize, gee, is this really what I want for myself? And almost as if we didn't have a choice, but we did. So I guess to answer your question, how do we find joy? First of all, let's reconnect to ourselves and be daring. I know it's scary for some people because sometimes we have a lot of people to answer to, but we live our life. So why not start by answering to ourselves first? And if that's hard for you, if you're listening in, I would say just start with small things, right? If someone asks you to do something and you don't want to do it, maybe you can ask yourself, well, what do I really want to do? I don't want to go to that party, right? Maybe I could just stay home for today and see how that feels. It might be uncomfortable at the start, but slowly that discomfort may give way to, like, wow, this is great. I chose myself, and that's a lot of what I have been doing in my journey. And that is, I'm choosing myself. And it's uncomfortable, and people may not like me as much, right? People may not ask me out as much, but hey, I'm pretty happy with my company, or I'm choosing my children tonight instead of going for a work event. And I think it's just little steps every day. And to your point on sustainability, doing something big once in a while is actually more scary than doing something small a little bit over time, and you build those positive habits that can actually shift your life.
I really love what you have shared, and this brings us back to courage and self confidence. And I was wondering if you could share from your experience what would be some tips that you may have for our listeners in terms of building their courage to be themselves, to be authentic with their needs and desires, and to build that self confidence that is so important to living with more joy.
Yeah, I think first, for those of you who want to get to know what you're good at, I would really suggest doing this survey by the VIA Institute called the Character Strength Survey. It's free for you to do, and in 10 minutes, it will identify your top five strengths. And based on those five strengths, you would realize that, hey, that those strengths are really who I am. And the first question you can ask is, where in my life at this moment am I using and living out these strengths? Right? So for me, right on top of my list is love. And for me, that's very natural. It's very energizing to use. And I can see it in my family life, in the work that I do, and, all around me. And that gives me confidence because I can connect with that internal part of myself. And nobody can take that away from me. So I think that's a great place to start. And, here in Singapore, sometimes we hear a lot about what we can't do, but each time you do something great, I would say celebrate that small win. You don't have to only wait for the big win to, pop out the champagne, right? If, some days are difficult for you to get out of bed and, be productive. And if you did get out of bed that day, I would say, hey, give yourself a pat on the shoulder. I did it today. I got up today. I showed up today. We often discount all these small wins in favor of waiting for the big win. But what if the big win is 3 months away? Does it mean that you forsake and forego joy in the moment? Right? So a lot of it is, I think, seizing the moment, looking at the small things, allowing the small things to accumulate into the big things. And I think the third piece is finding people whom you can be yourself around and feel safe. It's not always easy, but if you do have one or two people around whom you can, talk about hard things, but also talk about great things, then I think that would really support you in your journey.
I was wondering if you can share with us your advice for parents, particularly when you're looking at how kids' brains develop. When they're very, very young, they're really fueled by emotion. And
Yes.
because the rational brain is not necessarily fully developed until,
Yes.
beyond their 20s. So when you're in an intense situation with a very young child, or maybe
Hmm.
multiple children, whereby maybe you've had a tough day and it's been quite challenging, what advice would you have for parents to find joy and understand the realities of the development of the brains of their children, and
Mm.
react and proactively embrace the conversations or actions that are more age appropriate, rather than
Mm.
naturally implement actions that may be more appropriate in an adult, let's just say, one-on-one interaction?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, the first thing I would do is take care of you. You know, if you've had a long day and you are at your limit, I always talk to parents and say, have a transition ritual. And that is, if you're working from home, you could just say, okay, I'm turning off my computer now, or it's 6 o'clock. And maybe it's taking a few deep breaths. Maybe it's just making that mental switch, like, I'm going from work mode into home mode. If you're physically going to work, then just before you come back, open the door, you could also just gently remind yourself, that, hey, I'm transitioning. I think sometimes we just need this mental permission to move from one environment to another. Otherwise, you have this spillover effect and you project whatever frustration you're feeling onto your family members. It's the last thing we want to do, but yet it happens almost all the time. So I found this to be really helpful. That's one. The other piece is recognize that your children, whatever age group, so I've got a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old, and of course before that they were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And sometimes we have a belief that they're out to get us or they're doing this on purpose, and honestly that's not a healthy belief to continue to hold, because most of the time they have a need that's not currently being met, and therefore they misbehave to get that need, right? So a child who's throwing a tantrum, and my elder one used to do this, throw a tantrum and she would rotate 360 degrees on the floor for half an hour. And to think that she's doing that on purpose doesn't help, because you'll get angry that she's making you into a person you don't want to be, right? Rather, you say, what is the need in the moment that she might have? And maybe we can attend to the need. Most of the time, they just want you to be there. They want to feel safe. They want to feel that you care. It could be just sitting there with them or acknowledging the emotion in the moment. Looks like, there's so much going on for you. And the only way to get that emotion out is for you to go around in circles, right? And I think once you name it, label it, and put it out there, you as well get a sense that, I'm making sense of the behavior I'm seeing and perhaps the need that they're facing. And that may hopefully will calm you down, right? And for parents with teenagers, I would say don't aggravate the situation and say things like, I told you so. Teenagers are very sensitive to judgment. What they need is space, and probably what you need is space as well. So you could articulate it. You say, something I've said seems to have rubbed you the wrong way. I don't know what that is at the moment, but I do know that both of us are probably feeling some level of frustration or anger. And I'm going to just walk away, not because I don't want to talk to you at all, but because I think the emotions are too high. And let's get back later. But you can't do all of that if you haven't calmed yourself down and done that little transition ritual, which, as I've mentioned, I found really helpful to step into the home in the right way.
As we transition now from teenage years to early adult years, and those children are thinking about their career choices or their education choices, what advice would you have for parents in terms of guiding their children on a path that hopefully would lead them to experience more joy in their lives?
I found that with parents, it's always a very personal thing. Parents have expectations for their children, and of course, I do too. But we want to make sure that we are not imposing those expectations to the point where their own individuality and pathway is stifled. It's such a fine balance, right? Say too much and it looks like you're controlling. Say too little and you feel like you have no control, and that's a very helpless feeling as a parent. So, but I think that the base thing is to have a close and strong relationship with your young adult. And that is, check in on them, but let them know, I'm not here to micromanage you. I'm just concerned for you. It's okay to express how you feel. I'm concerned about you, you know. Many parents approach the opposite way, and that is, why are you doing that? That's not the right way to success, for example. And that judgment makes the relationship very tense. But if you approach with, I'm concerned and I just want to see what's going on for you, that's more coming from a place of care, and they're more likely then to open up. And I think if you have that baseline level of relationship, then you could potentially build upon that and talk about their career choices. And again, it's not about controlling, but maybe it's just helping them to think through. Hey, so you've chosen this particular, you know, first year module. What's your thinking around that? So it's very invitational. It's very co-creating, and you hear their responses, and maybe some part of it you don't agree. You can always say, well, if I'm not sure about that choice because I'm not you. But if it were me, I might make this choice. But ultimately, you are walking that path. But just know that I'm here for you if you are unsure. And let's talk it out, you know. Or we could be very functional and say, who could help you gain clarity on these answers that you have? Or what resources do you have to make this decision? Right? And actually, that's more supportive than telling them don't do this or do that, because sometimes they need to make their own decisions in life, right? So yeah, as I said, it's a delicate balance, but if you have that relationship, I believe that you can walk towards an outcome together, and at least they'll have you. You have their backs.
And talking about relationships,
Mm-hmm.
what would be some advice that you may have in terms of building harmonious, healthy, and positive relationships?
Reduce assumptions. I've made many assumptions in my relationships and they've never turned out well unless they're for the positive. I think what I mean by that is that sometimes we see certain behaviors and we think we can read their minds, and that's not helpful because they are who they are. And although you know certain patterns of behavior, if you know them long enough, they are just different people every day. So maybe it's good to just ask a question, hey, what's going on in your mind right now? What's going on for you, right? Or even in the way that you share something with them, you may want to check whether they're in a ready state to receive it, right? Like you've said, everyone could have a long day at work, and maybe the first thing you want to do is not to jump in with a criticism, for example, right? And I think a lot of it is based on trust as well, right? How to foster that trust is, I guess, it's keeping that open line of communication, and maybe having some level of vulnerability if they are a close friend, for example, if it's your spouse or your family member, the willingness to share, but also the willingness to listen, right? Listening is such an underrated skill. And, we often talk more than we listen. And I'm learning to listen more as I walk through all my relationships.
And listening without judgment, because that's the other
Yes,
reality
exactly.
behind that.
Yeah, sometimes relationships can be so loaded, right? That, when you listen, you're like, you have all these different historical points in your head. It's sometimes very challenging to pull back.
Based on all the research and science that you've been exploring over the years, are there any emerging trends in positive psychology that you have found particularly interesting most recently?
So, I mean, one of the areas that I've become more interested in is this area of trauma informed practices. Really understanding the root of why certain mental illnesses manifest, or even physical illnesses. And so, yeah, I've been learning a lot about that, been through courses. And one thing that I've come to realize is how fundamental it is to understand our nervous system, right? And for the listeners, I think a very simple way to understand it is that we have this nervous system that, if you think of the car metaphor, that has a accelerator, which is like the pedal to go faster, and the brake that asks us to brake. And sometimes when you have experiences or emotions that don't quite seem to add up, sometimes it's a matter of noticing this brake and accelerator in your nervous system. I have so many people who write to me or tell me in my workshops that they don't know how to stop working, or their brain is just on overdrive. And that's just an example of the accelerator continuing to be pressed and the brake not knowing how to kick in, right? Or some people who go numb, distract, and feel like they have no feelings. And that could be the brake permanently on without knowing how to activate the accelerator. So I think having that knowledge begins with noticing what's happening in our body. How do we feel when we're in certain circumstances? And we don't have to tell people about it, but we can just start to pay more attention to what's happening physically, emotionally, what's happening in our thoughts. So yeah, that's been something I'm really fascinated about recently.
So it really starts with greater self awareness, greater presence.
Yes, yes, absolutely spot on.
Have you noticed from your work any particular difference in terms of how certain individuals, whether it's from a personality perspective, from a cultural perspective, may embrace or not certain practices that relate to positive psychology?
That's such an interesting one. I feel like, when I first came back from the US, I was all for talking about strengths and like how fantastic it is. And I still remember culturally that didn't quite sit well, at least not in the way that I was talking about it. Because here in Asia, we are often taught to pay more attention to fix what's not working, or a common saying is, are you getting big headed? Stop going around to boast about what you're good at. Stay humble. And humility is something that's very valued over here. And so over the years, I've learned to nuance it as, you've got to know your strength, because if you don't know it, then how do you internalize it? And it's not about boasting, it's about remembering the things you have done well and being really concrete about what those are. If not, it's really hard to be confident from within. And I realize that sits better with people, you know. And you'll be surprised that there are people whom I've worked with who have lived like 50 years, and still do not know what their strengths are, because either they've never been told or it's not something they've learned to welcome and receive. So that's something really interesting for me.
I know you suggested before doing the VIA survey to identify your strengths, but if someone does not have the possibility to do that for whatever reasons, or are resisting, or do not have the time to do that assessment, what actions can they start doing immediately? I know often we think about just reflecting about your day and
Mm.
what specific actions brought you joy or brought you pain. And often those that brought you more joy are often potentially associated with the strengths that you may have and that you could potentially build on and expand on. Do you have any other tips that you may share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I often do this in my workshops, and that is to, create moments of joy. And listeners could do this as they're listening, and that is, take out a piece of paper. And sometimes when we think too much, we can't think of the moment because we're too cognitive. And so I get them to take out a pen and a paper and colors and markers, and I just ask them, draw the first image that comes to your mind that reminds you of a joyful moment. And I give them only 30 seconds to do it, because that activates a different part of their brain immediately. It is not just, oh, I'm overthinking. Does this even count as a joyful moment? Because that, I think that gets in the way of joy. But
Yes.
hey, let's just go to a memory. And most of the time, they will draw something related to a loved one, something related to a time spent, right? Something that actually they can put as something more intentional to do. But we forget in the busyness of life that those moments really bring us joy. So I would say, do that exercise. It's really fun. Do it with your family members, with your friends, and you'll be so surprised what comes up is a connecting thread amongst most people.
I love that. And whenever I think about joy, I also connect it to the concept of gratitude. And I was wondering if you can share for our audience, for our listeners, what you have learned and what has surprised you the most about the power of gratitude in terms of elevating our joy.
When I came back from Penn, and it was one of the things that people were doing a lot of, and that is writing a gratitude journal. And I would say that at first I was like, how is this journal actually going to help me? But then I committed to doing it because I wanted to learn it for myself. And I took out this, and I went at it for like 30 days. And even after the first 30 days, I was like, okay, so I've got a record of it. Like, so I guess at the time I was still, looking at it in a very intellectual exercise. But then as I got into month two, I started to realize that there was a pattern to the things that I was writing. I think that's where it was became really profound because I saw some names keep coming up. I saw some things that I was doing keep coming up. And that led me to the next step, which was to one of the other things that we had learned was to write a gratitude letter to somebody whom we have not actually articulated our appreciation to, right? And by looking back on the journal, I realized, wow, this person's name kept coming up. And so I wrote the letter and actually asked the person out for lunch and read the letter. It was, oh my God, I'm just feeling. And the person was like, what? And then by the end of the lunch, we were both crying because it's like, wow, you didn't realize how much that person meant to you until you actually sat down and articulated it. And that person also did not know it. So I think the power comes when you don't just look at it cognitively as a list. Many people do that, but to go deeper and allow yourself to feel it. Where is it coming from? And most of the time, it's from somewhere deep inside where you have a real appreciation for not just that person, but I mean, just in general for life. The fact that we are able to have this conversation already is amazing technology that we are able to connect this way in this present moment again is something worth appreciating. And I think the more we can start looking out for moments of gratitude, then we'll start to realize that life is already going good for us.
Yes, and I also want to touch upon some of the things you've shared before that relate to relationships and also experiences. And I'm sure you're aware of the grand study done by Harvard where
Yes.
they monitored for over 75 years the Harvard graduates as they were exploring their lives and their successes, their failures, and what was really the true essence of human fulfillment, and how
Mm,
at the end of that research, they concluded the importance of building strong, lasting relationships and how that actually even influenced not only our level of happiness, but
mm.
also our overall health, which I just find absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, this brings to mind like something that I do every week with my family. So in my family, we have of course the senior generation, which is like my aunt and her brothers, which includes my father. And then at my generation, we have three cousins, my sister and two other cousins. And what we do, and we've been doing this for many, many years, is every Saturday we'll meet up at one of our houses. We'll bring food, we'll bring wine, and the kids will come, and it's just this whole jing gang of 15 people, and it happens every week. We all love to cook, and sometimes every 2 years we travel together in a group of 20. And I think that study, when I read it, it reminds me of how this family has kept me going and actually all of us. And during COVID, even we had some restrictions here in Singapore. We had groups of 5 and groups of 8, but we still continued the ritual of four in one house and four in another house, and we would set up the Zoom and like, hey, what's everyone drinking tonight? Have you cooked? And I think how it actually adds to life is, number one, the children get to interact with each other. We have very small families these days, right? And they get to interact, and they're all different ages. And when we travel together, they look after each other. The big ones take turns to babysit, and then the small ones talk to each other, and they grow and they learn, and they learn what it means to share. They fight, they make up, so they're actually learning real positive skills. And then when my aunt comes along on some of these trips, or when some of my uncles are around, the kids actually help them, right? One of my uncles is visually impaired, and the kids help to bring his stuff. And I mean, it just keeps the whole I don't know, it's just like this machine that's very well oiled and just keeps going. And part of what I read in the study was also like simple things, reminding each other to take the medication, checking in with each other when someone's had the surgery, looking out or sending food to someone when they're sick. I mean, it makes total sense why not just health gets better, why your mental health is better, but also the longevity, because now you have this network that you can lean on. So I'm super grateful for what I have, and it reminds me so much of that study.
How beautiful. You're
Yeah,
among the fortunate ones
I
in
am.
this world to actually
Yes.
have such close relations with your loved ones. Since you have shared before your definition for happiness versus joy, I was wondering if you could share with us your definition of success.
Wow. Yeah, my definition of success, I think, is doing what you love, being around the people that you love, and when you look back on your life, you feel that it's been well lived, meaning that you have been through all the ups and downs of lives, not just the happy moments, but all the pain and suffering. It's all added up to something, and is that is worth celebrating at the end of life, I think, you know. And of course, if along the way you make money and have a great lifestyle, that's a bonus, I think. But I believe that if you are doing what you love and it's purposeful, then whatever money will come its way.
And what do you think we need to do collectively to bring more joy and harmony into our world?
I honestly think, especially since I've been through all this trauma informed work, that there's two things that we can do. One is to have the courage to be willing to work on ourselves and our pain. You know, it's very hard to do. And I must admit that I have a lot of privilege to be able to have access to that information. But I think we can all begin with some small steps, even if that journal is where you begin to begin appreciating and loving yourself. That's a very easy step to start. And if you don't even write it down, you could just think to it yourself, what is going well in my life? What do I appreciate about my life? And I think the more we can get to that space where we feel good internally, then the next step is to bring that outwardly. Can we be kinder to someone near us? Can we have more open mindedness to someone who's not like us? To welcome the complexity and diversity of other people. And of course, it's going to be uncomfortable if they're not like us because we can't relate at first. But I think if we have that openness and commitment to do that for someone else, then I think we're in a good space, because then at least we can have some level of trust that maybe someone else could do that for us.
A fun question for you. If you could
Yeah.
do an experiment on joy in a park or in a public space, what would you do?
I would have a park full of free ice cream and see how many people come and spend time with the ice cream and with each other. We used to have an ice cream man who comes to our neighborhood selling very traditional ice cream here in Singapore. And I can still see the good old days in the children's faces. So just imagine if we had free ice cream. That would be a fun experiment. I bet the adults would come and line up too. access their inner child.
Do you have any final words of wisdoms that you would like to share with our audience in terms of them experiencing and living with more joy?
I would say, look out for joy. Don't wait for joy to land in your lap. It's all around you, and I think for some people it may feel like it's blocked at the moment, but maybe that's because we're looking for the big joy. Sometimes it's just the little things in life that bring us joy, right? Enjoying that cup of coffee, having a 2-minute conversation with somebody, and they made your day, right? Even the commute on the way home, noticing, the rain, even if it's raining, right? I think joy is all around us. Can we allow ourselves to embrace it?
Sha-En, on those beautiful words, I want to express my gratitude for all the wisdom and insights you have shared. It's been immensely joyful.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrea. I've enjoyed our conversation tons as well.